Welcome all, I'm Peter Borner and I'm going to be your host today. I'm just going to give it a few moments to let the final few people join before we get started. Okay, I think now's a good time to get going. To those I haven't already said hello to, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us on our latest joint webinar with OneTrust. My name's Peter Borner. I'm CEO and co-founder of the Data Privacy Group. I will be your host today. Our guest speaker today is Andrea Sorge. Andrea is a privacy associate for preference choice at OneTrust. Andrea has extensive experience and knowledge of consent law across multiple jurisdictions and works to help advise firms on best practice. Today, we're focusing on consent and preference management. We're lucky to have Andrea here to share his extensive knowledge of best practice. After a quick introduction to the Data Privacy Group, Andrea will cover three aspects of consent: requirements, best practice, and where it's all heading in the future. Now, if you have questions, please pop them in the chat. If we have time at the end, we will answer as many as we can. If we run out of time, I promise we'll respond by email over the next 48 hours with answers to your questions. Before I hand off to Andrea, a quick few words about the Data Privacy Group. We are a premier OneTrust partner. In the firm, we have around 20% of the UK's Fellows of OneTrust Privacy Technology, several CIPP certified professionals, and OneTrust accredited GRC professionals. We are headquartered in the UK and also have offices in New York and Barcelona. We work with clients across 94 countries to implement OneTrust and to provide outsourced and managed services to ensure their privacy and trust offices work smoothly. As a OneTrust partner, we've enabled global FTSE and Fortune companies to untangle privacy regulations and manage their ongoing risks with transparency and trust. We address immediate privacy challenges, industry benchmarking, and we operationalize data privacy programs for our clients. We've delivered privacy programs in 28 languages with focuses on the GDPR, the CCPA, the LGPD, and many, many more of the tide of regulations constantly being enacted. As a OneTrust partner, we've built all of our solutions on top of the OneTrust platform by design. This allows us to deliver the most powerful, all-encompassing privacy and trust software to our clients and layer on specific workflows and management structures to drive maturity in our clients' trust programs. Coupled with these, we work with globally recognized law firms to ensure all our workflows meet requirements of the different regulations across the world. In addition to our OneTrust accreditations and partnership, we're also proud to be a member of the IAPP and with that ensure all our employees are across the data privacy news and key events as they happen. We're driving towards having all our employees IAPP certified. So, moving on to today's main topic, consent best practices. I'm excited to pass the baton to Andrea Sorge. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Peter, for your introduction. Let's start with the requirement of consent. About this, the GDPR provides 6 different legal bases for processing personal data. We have consent, compliance with legal obligation, public interest, contract, vital interest of the individual, and legitimate interest. Of course, among this list, the data subject consent plays a central role in GDPR and can be considered one of the most important legal bases for processing personal data. That said, the first question in relation to consent is what are the requirements for obtaining a valid consent? About this, the European Data Protection Board, in its guideline number 5/2020, addressed all these different points. In particular, the European Data Protection Board highlights that consent must be unbundled, so must be separate from other terms and conditions, must be informed, so that a subject must know what they are agreeing to, also must be freely given. About this, it is important to outline that there must not be an imbalance of power between controller and data subject. Also, pre-ticket boxes are not allowed under the GDPR. Only an active opt-in can be considered aligned with the requirement and with the GDPR. Also, the consent must be granular and easy to withdraw. Perfect. So let's move with the consent best practices. About this, the controller must first of all identify the processing activities, then assess whether consent is the most appropriate legal basis for that specific data processing activities. Indeed, we'll find in the next few slides that not every processing activities require the data subject consent. Then the controller must create a consent request, provide sufficient information, then create a record of consent, and, if necessary, manage and refresh consent. Then the data controller must set up a process for withdrawal. From this list, of course, provide adequate information, create a record of consent, and set up a process for withdrawal can be considered crucial in order to be aligned with the requirement of consent and the GDPR. That said, another question is that it is really important in relation to consent is always necessary to obtain user consent? You can see that it's not always necessary to require the data subject consent. For instance, processing employment data doesn't require the data subject consent. About this, the European Data Protection Board clearly remarked in its guideline number 5/2020 that the process of employment data usually should not rely upon consent. In fact, in this case, there is a clearly imbalance of power between employer and employee. Also, another case where consent is not required is in the processing of personal data through the use of CCTV camera. In fact, in this case, the correct legal basis for processing personal data is the legitimate interest of the data controller. Then, another useful case is the processing of personal data in direct marketing. Of course, we all know that the direct marketing usually rely upon the consent, but sometimes, as the recital number 47 remarked, also in the direct marketing, the data controller can process personal data with legitimate interest, not only with the consent of that data subject. Moving to the next slide, another specific case to address is the consent in merger and acquisition. In fact, there are several data protection risks related to the closing of an M&A deal. So, the data controller should assess in this case, first of all, what are the purposes for process personal data, the correct lawful basis for sharing personal data, and, if necessary, provide the correct and the adequate information to the data subject. One interesting case from an Italian court is that there is no need to obtain a new data subject consent after the acquisition, so after the closing of a deal in relation to a database. In that case, we're talking about 2017, the Italian court stated that the acquisition of this biobank does not necessarily require a new data subject consent after the closing of this specific deal. So this case, of course, is specifically related to a biobank, but we can also use this case in other situations where there is a closing of an MIDL. So just keep in mind that the data subject consent is not needed after the closing of a deal when an acquisition of a biobank is the object of that deal. Now let's move on with the next slide. Consent in direct marketing. When we talk about direct marketing, we should take into account data protection risk when an individual is being contacted for direct marketing. In the EU, there are different regulations and guidelines on consent for direct marketing. This rule may change from business to business to consumer and require strict opt-in or soft opt-in mechanism. In particular, in Germany, data protection in direct marketing is regulated by the Section 7 of the German Unfair Competition Act. Pursuant this law, marketing by email, fax, or telephone requires the explicit consent of the data subject. The German courts have adopted a strict interpretation of explicit consent, so pre-ticket boxes are not allowed. In order to be fully compliant with the German Unfair Competition Act and the GDPR, it is necessary to have a clear and affirmative action from the data subject. So, the consent should be referred to the specific purpose of sending marketing communication for a service or good. But there is an exemption. When data subjects have made their contact available in connection with the purchase of a product or service. In this specific case, it is not necessary to obtain the explicit consent of the data subject. In Italy, data protection in direct marketing is regulated by the Article 130 of the Italian Code of Privacy. This law distinguishes the use of automatic calling or communication system from the use of non-automatic telephone calls or mail. In the former case, there is a high potential risk for the data protection of individuals, so it is necessary to obtain the user consent. In the second case, so in the case of non-automated telephone calls or email, marketing communication are allowed to the extent that users have not entered their telephone number or personal data in a public opt-out register. So, in the case of non-automated telephone calls or mail, marketing communication are allowed if the user have not entered their telephone number or other personal data in a public opt-out register. On the enforcement side, the Italian Data Protection Authority has strongly investigated the direct marketing. In particular, in 2020, the Italian Data Protection Authority issued several fines against telecommunication companies. This was mainly due by the large number of complaints received by the Italian supervisory authority for unlawful processing of personal data. In one specific case, one individual has been contacted for 155 times in 1 month by a marketing agency. Also, it is worth noting that the most common violations identified are marketing calls to numbers that are already entered in the public opt-out register, consent not freely given, and lack of accountability. Differently, in UK, data protection direct marketing is regulated by the PCR, the Data Protection Act, and the UK GDPR. These laws cover any type of advertising communication, so not only for commercial purposes, but also promotional material from no-profit organization or political party. Also, this material should be directed to a specific individual. Accordingly, indiscriminated marketing communication are excluded from these laws. Also, only unsolicited direct marketing communication are covered by the PCR, the Data Protection Act, and the UK GDPR. In particular, the ECO, so the UK Data Protection Authority, has released guidance on the record of consent. So, in particular, the records of consent, when we talk about consent for direct marketing, but not only for direct marketing, must demonstrate who consented, when the data subject consented, how they consent, they give their consent, so in writing, voice, digital interface, if the consent was withdrawn at any time, what did they consent to, and in particular, and this is related to the consent requirement that we already talked about, if the consent was freely given, specific to a purpose, and a result of a positive action. These are all the different elements that a record of consent must demonstrate in order to be fully compliant with the GDPR, the PCR, and UK Data Protection Act. Now, let's move to the future of consent. So, basically, what are the latest developments in relation to consent? First, we have the e-privacy regulation. The e-privacy regulation, as part of the new European Data Protection Framework, will replace the e-privacy directive. Mainly, the aim of this new e-privacy regulation is to align the current rules that are part of the e-privacy directive with the new technology, so the technology innovation. In particular, the relevant element of the e-privacy regulation on consent are that over-the-top communication will be now covered, and in particular, we require the prior consent of data subject. Also, voice-to-voice calls that not involve the use of automated system may be allowed to the extent that user did not object to such processing. So basically, the privacy directive will have a broad scope and also will cover this over-the-top and voice-to-voice call that not involve the use of automated system. In the second case, this voice-to-voice call may be allowed to the extent that user did not object to such processing. Also, another relevant development when we talk about consent is the new German TDDSG. The TDDSG entered into force on the 1st December of 2021 and regulates the protection of confidentiality and privacy when using telecommunication telemedia services, such, for instance, website, messenger, or smart home device. When we talk about consent, in particular cookie consent, the TDSG implements the requirements of the e-privacy directive into the German national law. So in particular, like the Article 5 of the e-privacy directive, under the TDSG, cookie consent is not required where the sole purpose of storing information in the end-user terminal equipment or the sole purpose of accessing information already stored in the user terminal equipment is to carry out the transmission of a communication of a public telecommunication network or strictly necessary for the provider in order to provide a telemedia service explicitly. Basically, this new German TDSG adopted the requirement of the e-privacy directive into the German national law in relation to the cookie consent. Also, we have another really interesting development in relation to consent is the cross-domain consent. This is a new practice of asking one user consent for multiple domains of the same company. About this, only, and we say in particular, the CNIL addressed this issue by saying that there are different and several data protection risks associated with this practice. So, the CNIL, in its recommendation on cookies adopted in the 2020, highlight that when traces subjected to consent deposited by entities other than the publisher of the site or the mobile application allow monitoring of the user navigation via the site. So basically, when we talk about cross-domain consent, we should ask the data subject consent for each domain, not only for one consent for multiple domains of the same company. And this is a really important when we address all the different data protection risks associated with these practices. So basically, as stated by the CNIL in this recommendation, data controllers should ask for data subject consent for every domain, even if there are multiple domains of the same company. So, in conclusion, we found out the complexity of the consent framework in the EU when we talk about, for instance, consent for direct marketing, but also consent for merger and acquisition. That said, OneTrust can make it easy for you to capture, centralize, govern, and sync consent, preferences, and first-party data. Our easy-to-use consent management platform can be easily integrated with other applications and systems through API, SDK, data feeds, and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, so much for that extensive deep dive into the world of consent. It's clear you know this subject inside out, and I hope that everyone goes away from this webinar fully armed with the knowledge that they need to implement consent correctly in their firms. Now, I can see a number of questions have been posted in the chat, but unfortunately, we've simply run out of time for live Q&A. So I would ask you, please don't be disappointed. We have members of the team ready to pick up the questions and follow up with answers individually over the course of the next 24 to 48 hours. So, a final thank you from me to everyone that has joined today, and hope that you're able to take something away from this. If you want to reach out to Andrea or me, please feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. Follow any of our company pages across all of the major social platforms, or simply email hello@thedataprivacygroup.com. So a final thank you everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.